This is Katrin with Disability Rights New York. Welcome to our podcast, Empire State of Rights Closed Captioned. We are here to bring you information on the most relevant topics regarding disability rights and advocacy. Today we welcome David Johns, Executive Director of the National Black Justice Coalition, NBJC. He's here to discuss the importance of voting and its relationship to NBJC's mission and advocacy work. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Katrin, for making space for this conversation.
David, let's start by talking a little bit about your organization. Tell us about it and how it started, and talk to us a little bit about what NBJC's goals are.
For those who don't know, the National Black Justice Coalition is the nation's only civil rights organization that is both intentional and unapologetic in standing at the intersections of racial equity and LGBTQIA+ equality. What we know and why we exist is because as long as there have been Black people before the terms existed, LGBTQIA+, there were Black, queer, trans, non-binary folks. There's a writer, Some Sofu, who talks about in their village, the words lesbian and gay didn't exist. So a lot of our work is about highlighting the intersections that exist within our community, the ways in which the flattening of Blackness and perpetuation of myths that suggest that we're all monolithic and come from the same major metropolitan cities and have the same broken relationships with our fathers, et cetera, compound some of the challenges that, again, Black queer, Black trans, and Black non-binary folks face. And a lot of our work at present is focused on policy and praxis, so shifting the ways that primarily governments, federal, state, and local corporations and schools think about and they do the work of supporting the learning and development of Black people generally and Black, queer, trans, and non-binary folks more specifically. We do a lot of work around health and wellness. Historically, a lot of the work has been around HIV/AIDS, which continues to have a disproportionate impact on members of our community, often because of the stigma associated with the virus more than anything. And a lot of our work in the recent years has focused on mental health, acknowledging that, for example, suicide rates, both ideation, attempts and completion amongst Black youth in the last 2 decades, while they have decreased for every other group of children based on race and ethnicity. And then the last area of our work is around culture shift. So providing for competence training, working with schools, supporting networks of young people in ways that are aligned with ensuring that one day we can all live in what John Lewis talked about as a beloved community, where in particular members of our community who are Black and trans and queer and non-binary can show up without the threat of discrimination, bias, or hate crime.
There are an awful lot of issues that your organization is addressing on a regular basis. And I love that you brought John Lewis and the beloved community into the conversation. That gives us a nice segue into the next question. I mean, we're talking about voting, right? So we have a lot of elections coming up, and talk to us a little bit about voting and why is it so important to your organization and the goals of its future?
Yeah, what I know, in part because of the lessons that John Lewis continues to teach us. And what he talked about and what he committed his life to was ensuring that Black people specifically, and all Americans more generally, have the ability to exercise the right to vote, a right to be clear that has always been contested. I shared space yesterday with Reverend Jackson Jr., who, in spite of facing some health challenges of his own, is still showing up with righteous rage to guide those of us who are willing to listen to the lessons that our ancestors have allowed us to learn. And what he talked about, again, was that it was not until we had, or fought for rather, the ability to vote that we were met with the kind of terror that existed and is still associated with white supremacy, not just white boys and those who love them who wear sheets and tiki torches and sometimes machine guns, but all folks benefit from the ways in which access to whiteness by birth or by the ways in which it has been litigated over time so that people have access to it through courts, benefit from the idea that non-Black people are deserving of privileges, including safety. And this idea that justice means you can call the cops and they would be there to ensure your safety, when the reality continues to be that for most Black people, we can hope that if we are murdered by a police officer or someone who has a badge, that justice means that they might get arrested. Something that we have both an opportunity and an obligation in so many senses of the word to vote every election and as often as we can. And as frequently as people say that, and as frequently as people remind folks that people have died for our right to vote, we also have to spend much more time not only talking about, but doing work to ensure that when people cast ballots, and in particular in this election, when some people risk their lives in a global pandemic to cast a ballot because they are being forced by political actors in their states who are trying to continue to steal an election. To do so, they have to know that their vote is going to count, that the ballots that they are using and the machines that they are forced to engage with are not rigged in ways that will render their vote meaningless, that if they're going to mail in a ballot, that the post office will be operable in ways that will allow their vote to actually show up somewhere and be counted, or that if people are driving up to drop off a ballot and or are showing up to poll in a traditional way, that they will not encounter people who will enact pernicious forms of anti-Blackness and violence to dissuade people, or again, otherwise render their vote meaningless. And so this is a really, really, really long way of saying that we don't have enough conversations about everything that needs to happen so that people understand and appreciate the importance of voting and know that when they vote, their vote is going to count.
Those are some really important issues that you just brought up. And when we talk about voting and making sure that people get there, whether it's by mail or in person, how serious the vote is. And not only that, but can you talk a little bit about why it is so important to show up and how it is exactly that voting is going to help the community that you serve?
Yeah, I want to step back and acknowledge that this is about you inviting me to talk about voting, and it's also important for people to be counted in the census before the deadline, which has been extended to October 31st. It's also important for those who can. There's so many ways to complete the census. It takes less than 5 minutes. It's available in so many different languages for the first time, primarily available via the internet, tablet, or phone. And it is important for people to be counted in the census because local municipal resources that are used to apportion things like resources for hospitals in the middle of a global pandemic, or access to schools and resources for public education, resources for parks and recreational activities are also apportioned based on census count. And too often, historically, poor, what we continue to call minority, although technically Black and brown people are majorities in so many spaces, including traditional public schools. So just acknowledging the way that language works, often in problematic ways to affirm power and privilege. All of those things are impacted when we don't vote in the census and when people who are often in power overcounted and when our communities are undercounted in the census. As it relates to voting, it is also important for us to vote early and often. We typically celebrate opportunities to vote every 4 years in the presidential election, which is important. And we should do more to encourage people to vote down ballot and in off presidential cycle years. There are elections that happen almost every year at the local level. And often the individuals who run for and or are appointed to positions because they run uncontested are people who impact our lives in incredibly tangible ways. And so as I think about what it means for us to be on the other side of June, which was Pride Month for so many people, not for a lot of Black, queer, trans, and non-binary folks who live in parts of the country where it is legal to discriminate against them, or to deny access to public accommodations. Pride is very different for some members of our community is the point that I'm trying to make here. But as I think about what it means to be on the other side of June, the thing that I continue to struggle with is that there are so many members of our community who do not have access to the things that people take for granted that have been provided by the ability for people to go and vote. And so two of those things that I think are incredibly important to raise right now is that there are passing laws that restrict the ability for individuals who are gender non-conforming or non-binary to have identification that is consistent with the way that they exist in the world, which prohibits them from being able to vote. That has everything to do with attempting to control legislatures and to control budgets, such that, again, people are profiting from the members of marginalized communities and otherwise terrorizing people who are most marginalized by design. A second way that this continues to show up is that in every week since June, we have experienced at least two Black trans women being murdered every week. Just last week, there were two Black trans women who were murdered and a Black gender nonconforming person who the media misgendered, which happens often. I think the point that I'm attempting to make is that too often people take for granted the ability to vote in ways that are actively denied so many members of our community, in particular the Black community.
So, David, thank you so much for bringing up the census and talking about why voting is so important and how it affects every part of our lives. And now let's talk about some of the things that NBJC is doing to help get people to the polls in November.
Yeah, there are three things that we're focused on. One, we understand that there are strength in numbers, that we work in partnership and coalition with a number of both Black national and local organizations that have relationships with and in Black, queer, Black trans, and Black non-binary communities to ensure that the safety needs of members of our communities are met such that they can safely cast their ballots. In a number of states like Georgia, this includes a lot of active battles in the court system, acknowledging that Brian Kemp and other political officials have against poor, minority, and overwhelmingly Democratic voters. And in other parts of our community, small, rural, and isolated communities, it looks like fighting against attempts to shut down the United States Postal Service, which would cripple and restrict the ability for individuals in those communities to be able to vote and engage in other forms of civic participation, to put it mildly. And so that is consistent with our advocacy efforts. We also continue to show up and have conversations like this with individuals who don't believe that their vote counts or are otherwise concerned about risking their safety in order to cast a ballot in a local election. There are also so many things that are happening, changes that are being implemented by the minute in states in response to the novel coronavirus and or our political climate. And so ensuring that people are aware of what their rights are, what the dates are by which they need to register to vote or show up to vote, and what their options are with regard to voting. There are some individuals in positions of power who are using certain communities, and in particular, at present, children as political pawns. And so we have significant concerns about the reality that for decades, maybe even for centuries, Black families have offered up their children to experience the kinds of violence that are associated with traditional public schools that do not nurture positive forms of racial identity development, that do not nurture by design the cognitive, social, and emotional learning and development of Black children, that are ill-equipped to respond to the toxic stress associated with anti-Blackness. And it is beyond concerning that we would, as a community, consider also offering up our children to experience the complications and challenges that are associated with the novel coronavirus. And so talking about how public safety concerns and conversations are directly connected to the individuals that are in office as a result of us voting or not voting, and the importance of holding individuals accountable after the date that we all show up to vote or the date that we are supposed to mail in our ballots so that they can be counted in an election, is also a critically important part of our work.
And so as we get to the end of this podcast, because voting, I think we could probably talk about for hours and hours and its impact on all that we do, is there anything else that you would want to talk about, whether it's around the census or around voting? Is there anything specifically that NBJC has available for people to reach out to you and to contact you if they need to?
Yeah, most definitely. We have a number of resources available on our website, nbjc.org. Encourage people to take advantage of them. And in particular, there is a video and a number of assets around the census and a lot of the questions and concerns that we heard raised over the last few years, primarily around protection and privacy, that we attempt to proactively address. And so after you're able to consume those, if you're able to consume those, and you still have questions, please let me know. I'm happy to further address them. The website, again, is nbjc.org. I would also encourage everyone to double check, and triple check your voter status. There are some individuals being purged from the voter rolls and would otherwise be denied access to voting on election day. There are, again, as I mentioned previously, rapid changes and processes around and opportunities to vote that are changing state by state. And so using an organization like vote.org or a number of other partners that we spotlight on our website to, again, check your status and be up to date on dates and other requirements that vary by state is also critically important.
David, thank you so much for your time today and speaking with us about this important subject. I look forward to speaking with you again.
My pleasure. I look forward to it.
Empire State of Rights Closed Captioned has been brought to you by Disability Rights New York, your source for disability rights and advocacy. If you enjoyed our program, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this post. If there is a subject you would like us to discuss, please email podcast@drny.org or comment below. Tune in next Wednesday, where we'll bring you more information on disability rights in the state of New York. The closed captioned and ASL version of this podcast is available on our YouTube channel. To listen to more Empire State of Rights closed captioned, follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.